Welcome back as we read the last chapter, Chapter 6, Otis and Ellen. Otis Spofford could not think of a time when he had been so uncomfortable as he was this Saturday morning. He was shivering in his undershirt, waiting for his mother to iron him a shirt so he could go skating at the lake. Mrs. Spofford always put off ironing shirts until the last minute. This time Otis couldn't wear a t-shirt because she had painted the kitchen cupboards yellow, and somehow both of his t-shirts had been used for paint rags. Worse than being cold, however, was the thought of yesterday, how he cut Ellen's hair, and the lecture the principal gave him, and how he squirmed on his chair while he had to listen to Mr. Howe telephone Mrs. Tibbets and tell her what had happened to Ellen's hair. Otis listened to his mother's wet fingers sizzle against the iron and watched her pull a shirt out of the clothes basket and unfurl it over the ironing board. "Gee, Mom, can't you hurry?" he begged. "I want to get out to the lake before the crowd." Otis did not say he was especially anxious to get to the lake because this was his only chance to skate. The principal had told him he would have to stay after school every day for the next week. Mrs. Spofford pushed the iron rapidly back and forth while Otis rubbed his arms to keep warm. "Otis," she said, "I want to have a talk with you." Otis was not surprised. Grown-ups were always wanting to have talks with him. This time he knew what it was about. Mrs. Tibbets had phoned his mother at the dancing school about Ellen's hair. Now he was going to catch it all over again. "It's about Ellen," said his mother. "Yeah, I know," answered Otis. Mrs. Spofford continued, "When Mrs. Tibbets came to the studio to pay for Ellen's dancing lessons last week, she said Ellen is upset because you chase her. I don't think that is a very nice thing to do you?" "But she runs," said Otis, kicking at a fluff of dust on the floor to hide his surprise. Something was wrong. Maybe his mother hadn't heard about Ellen's hair. "If she didn't run, I couldn't chase her, could I?" "Just the same, Mother would rather you didn't. If you upset Ellen, she might stop taking dancing lessons, and we can't afford that. We need all the pupils we can get." She won't stop taking lessons. She's always talking about being a famous ballerina when she grows up. Anyway, I stopped chasing her." Otis did not bother to tell his mother why he had stopped. He wished Mrs. Tibbets had phoned her about the hair. He wanted to get it over with so he could forget the whole thing. "That's a good boy." Miss Spofford handed Otis his shirt. "There are still some wrinkles in it, but I can't spend any more time on it or I'll be late for my class." Otis hurriedly put on his shirt, which was still warm from the iron, but damp at the collar and seams. "Bye, Mom," he called as he put on his jacket, picked up his skates, and hurried out of the apartment. He wasn't going to let Ellen's hair spoil his skating. There was plenty of time to worry when he came home. He ran down the street, past the Spofford School of the Dance and the Payless drugstore to the bus stop. When Otis got off the bus, he ran 2 blocks to the park, where he waded through the snow to the edge of the lake. There he sat on a bench to take off his boots and shoes and put on the old skates someone had given him. With 3 pairs of socks, they were a pretty good fit. Otis left his boots under the bench, and after knotting the luminous laces of his shoes together, hung them on a bush. There was no danger of anyone's taking his shoes by mistake. Not a green lace in one and a pink lace in the other. Anybody at Rosemont School would know those shoes belonged to Otis Spofford. As for his boots, they were plainly marked with his name in indelible pencil. Mrs. Gittler had seen to it that there would be no mix-ups over the boots and rubber boots in her cloakroom. Otis, who practiced at Iceland whenever he had enough money, was a fairly good skater. Eagerly, he stepped on the ice and started around the lake. It seemed strange to skate without organ music, but it was fun to be outdoors and watch the snowflakes drift down the ice and the trees around it. Around and around the lake he skated. His troubles over Ellen's hair no longer seemed important. Otis was enjoying every minute, but he could hardly wait for some of the other fellows to arrive. Then he would really have some fun. Otis tried darting in front of the skaters to see how close he could come without hitting anyone. Here there was no attendant to tell him to stop, the way there was at Iceland. Ahead of him was a girl on white figure skates who was moving timidly along at the edge of the lake. Her ankles wobbled, and she held her hands ready to grab a bush if she started to fall. Otis noticed that she had short brown hair that curled around her red earmuffs. Otis darted in front of the girl and then looked over his shoulder to see what was happening. The curly-haired girl started to fall. As he grabbed a bush, Otis saw who she was. He was so surprised that his feet flew out from under him, and he sat down on the ice so hard he bit his tongue. The girl with the curly brown hair was Ellen Tibbets. "Otis Spofford, you leave me alone," said Ellen furiously, as she clung to the bush. "I've had enough of you." Otis sat on the ice and stared. "Your hair," he asked. "What did you do to your hair?" Ellen glared. "My mother cut it off even and gave me a home permanent, so now my hair will be curly while I wait for it to grow long enough for pigtails," she answered as Augustine coasted across the ice to her side. Augustine pretended not to see Otis. "Come on, Ellen," she said. "There are some people around here we don't want to have anything to do with." But just the same, Ellen said fiercely to Otis, "You're going to be sorry for what you did. You've been teasing me ever since you came to Rosemont School, and I've had enough. You're just a pest, what you are." Otis recovered from his surprise and got to his feet. "Ah," he muttered, not wanting to let on he was already sorry. So that is why Mrs. Timmins had phoned his mother. She had been busy curling Ellen's hair. Ellen's brown eyes flashed. "And you know something else?" she said. "I'm not scared of you anymore." She stepped forward, put her hands on Otis's shoulders, and pushed as hard as she could. Otis staggered backward and sat down hard on the ice a second time. The wind was knocked out of him. Unable to speak, he stared up at Ellen in amazement. Ellen Tibbets pushing him? Ellen, of all people. "So there," said Ellen. "Yes, so there," repeated Augustine, joining hands with Ellen. "So there, tee-hee." Ignoring Otis, the two girls skated shakingly away along the edge of the lake. Dazed, Otis stared at them. He would not have been surprised if Augustine had pushed him. But Ellen? When he finally got to his feet, something made him glare over his shoulder. Ellen and Augustine, no longer shaky on their skates, had circled the lake and were behind him once more. "Maybe I better sort of disappear in the crowd," Otis thought. But before he had a chance, Augustine spotted him. She scooped up a handful of snow, wadded it into a ball, and threw. Otis ducked too late. The snowball slammed against his shoulder. Some of the skaters in the crowd laughed. "I bet that old brother of Augustine's taught her to throw," Otis thought crossly. "Pie face," said Augustine haughtily, as she and Ellen skated by. "You just wait." Otis skated unhappily around and around the lake. He was careful to stay out of the girls' way. Skating wasn't so much fun after all. Maybe he should leave and go coasting instead. Then Otis caught a glimpse of George and Stewie through the crowd. Eagerly he skated toward the two boys. Now he would have some fun. "Hi, fellas," he said, dragging one toe on the ice to slow himself down. "Gee, I thought you'd never get here." "Hi," answered George and Stewie. They sound sort of funny, thought Otis, but he said, Come on, I'll race you round the lake. Stewie looked at him coldly and said, Why don't you go find somebody to pick on? Somebody littler than you. Yes, agreed George, some girl. For a minute, Otis was unable to believe what he heard. But, he said weakly, he couldn't find words to finish the sentence without so much as a backward glance. George and Stewie skated off into the crowd. Ah, hey, fellas, Otis called, but no one heard. Dazed, he stood and let the crowd skate around him. Gee whiz, didn't he have any friends left? Just because he cut off a hunk of Ellen's hair when he didn't really mean to, did the whole world have to turn against him? And Stewie, why, it was old Stewie who egged him on. If it hadn't been for Stewie, he wouldn't have been in this mess after all. Some friend he turned out to be. Out of the way, stupid, said a skater, still dazed. Otis made his way through the crowd to the edge of the lake. Now he had to avoid not only the girls, but George and Stewie as well. He guessed he wouldn't skate around the lake anymore. Half-heartedly, he tried skating backward, but it wasn't any fun alone. While Otis was trying to think what to do, he caught the sound of his name above the scrape of skate blades on the ice. It was Linda speaking to the two girls he did not know. See that boy over there? His name is Otis Spofford. Otis heard her say. He's in my room at school, and yesterday he did the awfulest thing. There's a girl who's been trying to grow pigtails for months, and Otis moved away. He didn't want to hear how terrible he was. Couldn't anybody see he hadn't meant to cut Ellen's hair? Things just happened too fast, was all. Otis practiced skating with his hands in his pockets a while, but he didn't enjoy it. A light flurry of snow fell on the wind, and the wind grew colder. Otis knew it was time to start home for lunch. He might as well. He wasn't having any fun anyway. But Otis went to the bench to get his shoes and boots. He found Ellen and Augustine there ahead of him. Their noses were red and their fingers looked numb as they unlaced their skates and put on their shoes. Otis started to slip away before they saw him. Then he suddenly changed his mind. Why should he be scared of a couple of girls? Maybe he had done something he shouldn't, but what could they do to him besides push him and throw a few snowballs at him? Nothing, that's what. Frizzletop! Otis yelled at Ellen. There, that ought to show them he wasn't worried. The girls ignored him. Ellen leaned over to find her boots in the pile that had collected under the bench. Otis could see snowflakes clinging to her new curls. Hey, Frizzletop, leave my boots alone. Otis yelled and clapped his damp gloves together to warm his hands. Otis Spofford worried by a couple of girls? Ha! What a joke. Nobody wants your old boots. Ellen pulled 2 pairs of red rubber boots out from underneath the bench and gave 1 pair to Augustine. Otis skated around in a circle. Brr, it was cold. He wished the girls would hurry up and leave so he could put on his shoes and go home. When Otis looked at the girls again, Ellen was whispering in Augustine's ear. Augustine looked surprised and then delighted. As she nodded her head, both girls glanced at Otis and giggled. Now what are they up to? Otis wondered. As he looked down at his feet and tried to cut a figure 8 on the ice, he lost his balance on the first stroke, and when he looked up again, he was horrified at what he saw. Ellen was holding his shoes by the pink and green laces. Augustine held one of the boots in his hand. Goodbye, Otis, they both called as they waved his footwear. Then they turned and started across the snow. Hey, yelled Otis, come back here. He skated so fast to the edge of the lake that he tripped and almost fell. Hey, you, come back here, he called. Giggling, Ellen and Augustine waved the shoes and rubber boots. Of course, they were just teasing him. They wouldn't dare go off and leave him without his shoes. Otis decided to go along with their joke. So long, he called. That would show them that he wasn't worried. So long, answered Augustine cheerfully. You'll be sorry, Ellen sang out as she smiled and waved the scuffed Oxfords with the gleaming laces. There was something about the way the girls acted that made Otis afraid not to grin. "Ah, come on, I know you're joking," he said. "Oh, no, we're not," said Ellen and Augustine at the same time. Once more they turned and started out of the park. By that time, a group of skaters, including Stewie and George, had gathered to watch Otis and to laugh at him. "I guess they're going to fix you," called Stewie. "Boy, this is going to be good," said George, and the boys laughed. Otis stepped up onto the bank of the lake. "Hey, Ellen," he pleaded, "come on, cut it out." "Frizzletop to you," Ellen answered over her shoulder. Then she and Augustine shrieked with laughter. The rest of the skaters laughed too, but Otis didn't think it was funny. It wasn't funny at all. There was nothing for Otis to do but go after the girls. He ran into the snow on his skates, calling, "Hey, Ellen, wait a sec." The girls paused to let Otis come closer. Ellen dangled the shoes by the laces. Augustine, who was wearing a boot on each hand, clapped them together. Just as Otis thought they were going to let him catch up, the girls turned and ran. Otis ran faster, but they had a head start. Besides, they were not wearing skates. Maybe they would stop teasing and give back his shoes when they came to the edge of the park. They could hardly expect him to run after them on his skates on the sidewalks, which had been cleared of snow. At the edge of the park, the two girls paused and waved. "Yoo-hoo, Otis!" they sang out before they ran on. Through the shrubs that bordered the park, Otis could hear two pairs of boots clomping on the cement. A shortcut was his only chance. He pushed his way into the bushes. Branches caught at his clothes and snapped in his face. Snow showered over him. He burst out onto the sidewalk in front of the girls. "Look out, there he is!" Ellen shouted, and both girls turned and ran the other way. Otis did not care how dull the cement was making his skates. He was going after those girls, and he was going to catch them. "You just wait," he yelled, as the steel blades on his feet ground against the sidewalk. Running on skates made his toes hurt and his legs ache. Ellen paused long enough to stick her tongue out at him. Otis scooped a handful of snow, squeezed it into a ball, and hit her between the shoulders. Bits of snow clung to her coat. At the intersection, the girls crossed the street with the green light. Otis reached the corner just as the light turned to yellow and then to red, and he waited for it to change. He saw George and Stewie running down the street toward him. They would have to turn up now, thought Otis miserably. Now I'll never hear the last of this. As the signal changed, George and Stewie caught up with Otis. The girls standing on the opposite curve waved the shoes and boots. "Yoo-hoo, Otis!" they yelled. His shoe laces gleamed brightly through a flurry of snow. "I guess they fixed you." George was laughing so hard they could hardly get the words out. "And old Ellen Tibbetts, too." Stewie laughed even harder. "Boy, I wouldn't miss this for anything." Otis wasn't going to listen to any more of the boys golfing. He stepped out of the snow and ground his way across the street. The two boys followed. "Hey, Ellen," Otis called desperately. "I'm sorry about your hair." "It's too late now," yelled Ellen. The girls began to run again. Then Augustine tripped and fell. As Ellen paused to help her to her feet, Otis nearly caught up with them. "Now I've got you," he said. He thought grimly. "Hey, Ellen," yelled Stewie, "throw!" Two shoes and two boots sailed over Otis's head. He jumped and tried to snatch them out of the air, but the girls had been too quick for him. He landed on the sidewalk with a jolt that turned both of his ankles. George and Stewie scrambled to pick up his footwear. "Ellen, Augustine, run!" ordered Stewie. The girls ran. The two boys dashed past Otis and caught up with Ellen and Augustine. The girls took back Otis's shoes and boots and ran down the street. George and Stewie turned back toward the park. Otis glowered as they passed him once more. "You're some pals," he grumbled. "Remember the bullfight?" asked George. "And remember Spud's flea?" asked Stewie. Otis had no answer. "We're going to get a couple of hot dogs and then go skate some more," said George. "Too bad you don't have shoes, so you could come with us." "Go on, eat your old hot dogs. I don't care," muttered Otis, but he knew he did care. Anyway, he thought, those girls can't run all the way home. I'll catch them at the bus stop. I'll fix them yet. Even though it was difficult to run in rubber boots, the girls managed to stay half a block ahead of Otis. When they turned the corner by the bus stop, Otis thought, "Now I'll get them." He decided the first thing he would do would be to wash Ellen's face with snow. That Ellen Tibbet, she'd be sorry. As Otis limped around the corner, he stopped and started. The bus was pulling out from the curb. Ellen and Augustine were not in sight. "Hey, come back here," Otis yelled at the bus. He could not believe the girls had actually left him to go home on the bus without his shoes. He looked around to see if they had hidden his shoes and boots. Then he looked after the bus. There in the back window was the very thing he did not want to see. Ellen was waving his shoes. Augustine was waving his boots. Otis made a good hard snowball and threw it after the bus. How his legs ached. Leaning against the bus stop sign, he glumly made a design in the dirty snow with his skate. Girls, he thought bitterly, and Ellen Tibbets of all people, and just because they were best friends, Augustine had to help her. When he caught up with them, he would not only wash their faces, he would put snow down their necks. Otis began to worry about getting on the next bus. Probably the driver wouldn't let him on wearing skates. Well, he couldn't very well take them off. He turned down his pant cuffs and stepped into a pile of snow so his skate blades wouldn't show. When the bus came, Otis's fingers were so cold that after finding the dime in his pocket, he dropped it on the floor where it rolled under the driver's seat. "I'll get it," said Otis quickly, but the driver had already bent to pick it up. When the man straightened up with the dime in his hand, he looked at Otis and he shook his head and said, "I suppose there's some reason why you're wearing skates on the bus." "Isn't it all right?" asked Otis. "They aren't very sharp, see?" He grabbed the fare box to steady himself and held up on one foot. "I see," said the driver as the passengers began to laugh. "Is there a rule that says I can't wear skates on the bus?" Otis wanted to know. The driver had to let him ride. He couldn't walk home with his toes hurting and his legs aching this way. "The only reason there isn't a rule is that nobody ever thought anyone would want to wear skates on a bus. Takes a boy to think up something like that." The driver shook his head again. "Now sit down on that seat behind me and don't step on anyone." Ordinarily, Otis would have been pleased to stir up a little excitement on the bus, but now all he wanted to do was rest his aching legs a few minutes. He wiggled his toes and wondered how many blisters he had. His toes were so numb with cold he couldn't tell. Maybe his feet were raw and bleeding. "Boys," muttered the driver as he closed the door and shifted gears. "Boys!" On the way home, Otis worried about his shoes. What would Ellen and Augustine do with them? They were the only shoes he had for wearing to school in cold weather. He pictured himself going to school on the skates. For a minute he thought it might be a good idea. He would like to see Mrs. Gittler's face when he walked into her room on skates. Then he thought how his legs ached and how he wouldn't be able to play dodgeball during lunch period. No, it wasn't worth it. He would rather wear shoes to school. When Otis got off the bus at the corner by the post office, he thought he heard giggles. The two girls popped out from behind a sign that said, "Uncle Sam needs you." Rosie and breathless with laughter and cold, they started running again. This time they were not running very fast. Now I'll catch them, thought Otis, and I'll scrub their faces with snow. But when he started to run, he found his legs were so tired they would no longer move the way they were supposed to. He felt as if he were running in slow motion. "Oh, Ellen," he heard Augustine say, as she stopped to lean against a tree, "I've run so much my side hurts." "So does mine," panted Ellen, "but we can't let him catch us now." In the cold air, Otis could see Ellen's breath coming from her mouth in quick puffs. Around the corner they went, past the Payless drugstore and the entrance to Spofford School of the Dance. Valerie Todd Spofford was just coming out of the building. "Hello, Miss Spofford," panted Ellen and Augustine as they ran past. "Hello, girls," said Miss Spofford. "My, you're in a hurry, aren't you?" Augustine nodded and pointed toward Otis, who was trying desperately to put on a burst of speed. "Otis Spofford!" exclaimed his mother. "I am disappointed in you. What did I say to you this morning about chasing the girls?" "But I'm not chasing them," Otis protested, as the girls slowed down to listen. "Why, Otis, I just saw you." Miss Spofford sounded shocked. "He is, too, chasing us," said Ellen. "He chased us all the way home." The girls began to giggle. "I was running after them, but I wasn't chasing them." Otis did not suppose his mother would see the difference. "Now, Otis," said Miss Spofford. Then he saw his skates. "Otis Spofford, is that any way to treat a perfectly good pair of skates?" "No, but—" Otis saw Ellen and Augustine walking rapidly down the street. Now, how was he going to explain this to his mother? "No, but—" he started again. His mother interrupted. "Otis, I don't know what's gotten into you. Now run along home while I pick up some groceries for lunch." Valerie Todd Spofford turned up the collar of her coat against the cold and hurried down the street. "Girls," thought Otis grimly, as he limped along on his aching legs. And now his mother said he was chasing them. Well, they could keep his old shoes. He didn't care. He probably had so many blisters on his toes he couldn't get them on anyway. Maybe he would have to stay home from school. Then they would be sorry. Otis felt more and more sorry for himself. The more he thought about himself, the sadder he became. Half-frozen, no shoes, blisters on his feet, picked on by girls, misunderstood by his mother, and hungry besides. When at last Otis limped up the street to his apartment house, the only person in sight was Bucky, who was sitting on the front steps eating a cupcake. There was a lopsided snowman near the steps. Wearily, Otis threw himself down beside Bucky. "Hi," he said, looking hungrily at the cupcake. He just his luck to run into Bucky. Now he would have a lot of explaining to do about his skates. Little kids always ask so many questions. "Hi," said Bucky, digging into the pocket of his snowsuit. "Want a cupcake? I saved one for you." "Sure." Otis took the crumbled cupcake. He took a big bite. Chocolate with nuts. He felt better almost at once, but boy, how he ached. And his feet. "How come you're wearing skates?" Bucky wanted to know. "Because," Otis answered, was muffled by a mouthful of cupcake. What would the kids at school say when they heard about the good joke Ellen played on him? And it was a good joke, he grudgingly admitted. She sure did get even with him for cutting her hair. He just hoped she brought his shoes back before Monday. Otis started to lick the frosting off his fingers so he could unlace the skates. Suddenly, Ellen and Augustine popped around the corner of the apartment house. "Why, there's Otis Spofford." Augustine tended to be surprised. "Fancy meeting you here," said Ellen sweetly. "Now what?" thought Otis as he glared at the girls. "We found a pair of shoes and a pair of boots at the lake, and we wondered if they were yours," said Ellen. Both girls went off into a gale of giggles. "Otis," said Bucky, "how could you forget your shoes?" Otis made the girls this made the girls scream with laughter. Ah, cut out the funny business. Otis was too tired to think about washing the girls' faces with snow. All he wanted to do was sit right where he was. You give me my shoes. So long as you said you were sorry you cut my hair, you can have them if you promise to stop teasing me, said Ellen. And cross your heart and hope to die and stew and fry, added Augustine. Otis was silent. Girls? Well, come on, Augustine, said Ellen. I guess he doesn't want his shoes back. I guess not, agreed Augustine, starting to walk away. Hey, wait a minute, begged Otis. I've got to have them. Then he thought of something. Quickly, he thrust one hand behind his back. Are you going to stop teasing me? Ellen demanded. Otis didn't want to say it. Okay, he muttered. And cross your heart and hope to die and stew and fry, repeated Augustine firmly. This my heart, hope to die and stew and fry, Otis mumbled. The girls handed him his shoes and boots. Then they burst into a fit of giggles and started down the street. Are you really going to stop teasing Ellen? Bucky wanted to know. Otis grinned and said, I'll still tease her, all right, but after today I won't tease her as much. He looked at the girls whose shoulders were shaking with laughter. Hey, Ellen, he yelled. Look! The girls turned, and Otis held up his right hand with 2 fingers crossed. I had kings all the time, he shouted. And there's the end of the book. Next, you can read in the next book about Ellen Tibbetts and the first chapter of Ellen Tibbetts at Ellen's Secret. And as you know, Beverly Cleary writes many, many, many good books. You can learn about Ramona and Socks and Henry Huggins, Ellen Tibbetts some more, and Ribsy and Muggy Maggie and Ramona again. So there's tons and tons of Beverly Cleary books, and they're all so great. So read more about her characters and get you another Beverly Cleary book.